Matthew frequently refers to events in Jesus' life and quotes Old Testament passages and says this was to fulfill what was written by the Old Testament prophet. And students and scholars look at some of those and they go, is Matthew playing fast and loose with the Old Testament text here? Is that really what it meant in its original context? There's a couple things we need to say in response. One is the sense that when Matthew says this was fulfilled, he's not always referring to a once-for-all kind of fulfillment. In other words, maybe the word fulfilled is not quite the right word in every case. Because for Matthew, Jesus is the climax of what we call salvation history, the climax of God's purpose and plan. Everything that came before him in history comes to its climax in Jesus Christ. And so there's a sense in which everything in the Old Testament is fulfilled in Christ and his work on the cross. So I think when Matthew says this was fulfilled, really he's using the word in at least three different ways. Sometimes he means this was fulfilled specifically once and for all. This prophecy was fulfilled only in Christ and by no one else throughout the history of the world. A prophecy like the prophecy of the Messiah's birth in Bethlehem, Micah 5:2, would be an example. Obviously, the claim that the Messiah, the King, will be born in Bethlehem, will reign forever, that was fulfilled by Jesus, not by any other king before him. There's other prophecies, though, that are fulfilled what we could call typologically. Typologically means that there have been examples of fulfillment in the past, but Jesus is the ultimate of that. He's the ultimate fulfillment. He brings to completion really what individuals in the past have done. Sometimes, for example, psalms are cited with reference to Jesus. And in context, those psalms are psalms of suffering righteous people in the past. And yet Jesus is the ultimate suffering righteous person. And so he is the absolute and complete fulfillment of that prophecy. I think other prophecies are fulfilled in a third sense, and that is simply by way of analogy, where Matthew says something like, this is similar to what has happened in the past. This parallels what has happened in the past. Once again, emphasizing the fact that Jesus is really the fulfillment of God's entire purpose and plan. Let me just give you one illustration to illustrate sort of a typological fulfillment. And that's in Matthew chapter 2, verse 15. When Joseph and Mary returned from Egypt to Israel after the persecution of Herod and their escape, they come back to Israel, and Matthew says this, he stayed until the death of Herod in Egypt, and so was fulfilled what the Lord had said through the prophet, quote, out of Egypt I called my son. Out of Egypt I called my son. That's a quotation from Hosea chapter 11, verse 1. And in context, the Son of God there is clearly Israel. God called Israel out of Egypt in the Exodus, delivered them, freed them from slavery in Egypt, and created his nation Israel. How can that apply to Jesus? Well, if we look throughout Matthew's gospel, Jesus is presented as essentially the fulfillment of Israel. Where Israel failed to be a light to the nations, a light to the world, Jesus has succeeded. Where Israel failed when tested in the wilderness, Jesus succeeded and overcame that temptation. So we get this strong Israel-Jesus typology throughout Matthew's gospel. So for him to say, Jesus fulfilled the prophecy, out of Egypt I called my son, he's not saying this passage was uniquely about Jesus. He's saying what Israel did in the Old Testament, or should have done in the Old Testament, Jesus actually fulfilled. Because he is the ultimate Israel. He is the true Israel. He is the fulfillment of what Israel was meant to be.